Want to know what Magnus Carlsen's biggest weakness is? Then you have come to the right place. And all three of the games that we will see here, they will all feature what, based on the data, is shown to be Carlsen's biggest weakness, at least with the black pieces. This first game was played by Carlsen with the black piece against Kamsky in the FIDE World Cup of 2005. This being a rapid game, and we do see a very symmetrical exchange sub on the board after a bit of a different move order. And yeah, after e4, e6, nowadays the move of queen to b3 is sort of considered the more critical approach, and positions like these is very safe and very hard for black to really get significant winning chances, as it were. It's a very safe way to play as white. But in the game, Kamsky played the move bishop b5, and interesting enough, Carlsen decided not to play the move of knight d7 that's considered quite standard, but just kept the symmetry with bishop b4, perhaps figuring out, okay, what can go too wrong here? It's a symmetrical position and so forth. But I think that the reason that the exchange Slav is what I consider to be the biggest weakness in Carlsen's game currently, that is with the black pieces, is because what he often does is rather than, let's say, just keeping the symmetry and just having a solid draw, which is not really so ideal when you're clearly the best player in the world, the best player of all time. What he does is he'll often try to mix it up and try to make things kind of dynamic, often going for this approach of like unbalancing the position and then trying to play g5 and just start an attack. But g5 is also a very double-edged move, of course, and if white does take back control of the game, then that weakness of the black king can become quite a big factor. If you are enjoying the video, do make sure to leave a like. Also, you can subscribe if you are new to the channel. In any case, the game saw black play the move of h5, which Robert Hubner actually was critical of, with the idea that you are giving up this pawn, but it's actually not all of that as bad as it kind of looks. That being said, a move like rook c8 again would be a little bit more solid by comparison, but I'm going to go through this game relatively quickly, just so that way we have time to get to, some of the other more recent games of Carlsen's as well. Just keep in mind, Carlsen's only rated 2570, but you could say this is where his extreme Slav trauma happens. And it doesn't matter whether it's you or Carlsen or Gukesh, like everyone has at least one opening that they find somewhat traumatic as such. For me, it was the symmetrical English as black. And for Carlsen, you could say it was the exchange Slav from black. Now, at this point, you probably could even argue for a move like h3 or h4, just kind of making the point that you really are not too concerned about the double pawns here, because they just give you such a strong attack against their king in the future, with the half open file of the rook and already picking up the c6 pawn by force. Though the queen b6 isn't really a sufficient counterattack, because if they do try to defend the pawn, there's going to be problems with the knight d7 fork, so that's why you can't really do that. Also, even e4 is just going to bring the queen in the attack with tempo. So h4 is probably the best move, but knight e5, as Kamsky played, it's not necessarily so bad either. Honestly, the best option for black is probably just give up the pawn, but just rely on the fact that you are going to be threatening to take this bishop, or if white does play queen h5, which is probably what black was concerned about. It does turn out you actually do get some decent compensation here, just kind of based on the fact that the queen is sort of trapped and struggling to get back in the game. But that's admittedly maybe a little bit more of a computerish sort of idea, this double pawn sack with f6. Instead, black tried to trap the bishop with h4, but after knight c6, it turns out that, in fact, the bishop is not getting trapped here. So, quick puzzle for you guys, what would you play if black were to play f6 to trap the bishop as in the game? What's the move for white to save himself? If you need more time, you can pause, but I'll trust that you either figured it out or you just want to see the solution. So the answer is that we have the move of f3, where we attack the knight with a counterattack. If they take our bishop, we take their knight, and when the dust settles, we are going to be up a full extra pawn, and their king is completely naked. But after knight d6, yeah, we just take, and I mean, white is just a pawn up for nothing, and Kamsky, a very good technical player, obviously knows how to convert the advantage, stopping any counterplay first of all, and only then going ahead with the steady advance of the queenside majority. a6, a4, now we get a passed pawn after this exchange. e4 now starting the attack on the other front, and once again e5, the rest is going to be pretty easy when you're not just up a pawn, but their king is also very weak. So rook c5. I probably would have gone ef6 first, but the difference is pretty marginal. take, knight e5. And after a few moves, they're maybe not the most significant from here. Black did just resign. We are winning a piece with this last move of rook f takes bishop on f5. So a very crushing one by Kamsky, which okay, Kamsky's rated 2690 FIDE to Carlsen's 2570. Should kind of would expect White to win that, but what's kind of interesting is seeing even a couple of games later on that if you take the like Carlsen's score in the exchange Slav, it's only a 50% score, which considering he's like the highest rated player in the world is would be considered like a small failure for a player with standard. But after that sort of reversal with Bishop f5 setups against Kamsky, after that Carlsen decided to switch a little bit more to a6 setups, and the idea of a6 is that if they do play e3 now, you have Bishop g4 to pin the knight and get that little bit of an imbalance in the position with the later Bishop for knight exchange. And so it gives just more winning chance against a lower rated player. At the same time, we'll see from this game between Wesley So and Magnus Carlsen from Norway Chess 2018 that also here this rook c1 does give white some options. Black does play bishop g4. Now we can play knight e5 because we're not losing the queen in this version. Also, do make sure to stick around until the end because I will be showing you a game that was actually played just today, which kind of inspired this video. But that's bishop f5. This is kind of Carlsen's idea. Is he's saying that okay, maybe a6 is not the most useful, but rook c1 also probably wouldn't be the first choice of black either. You can also play the move e6, which, if I remember correctly, I think is what Carlsen actually played in the next game we'll see. But in this one, he played the move rook c8 instead. And rook c8 is basically aimed against queen b3, so you can go knight a5 and b5, and it means in a situation like this, you're able to kind of go back with the bishop sometimes if you were to try to sack on b5, which wouldn't be the case with the pawn on e6, kind of blocking that. So White plays bishop e2. Wesley So obviously very solid player. One of these plays are very much plays for two results, and yeah, this knight d7. That's not Carlsen's attempt to play something a little bit unusual, just try and get the opponent out of book. Whereas a move like bishop d6 is certainly the move that one might play if you are just trying to maintain some sort of solid equality with, something like this, which actually I played once against Igor Bielobruch in a big boards game about a decade ago. And I did go on to win that game with something like this. But to be fair, the position is also still one where white is kind of pressing without too much risk. So it's a position where both sides can kind of be happy with the situation. But yeah, in the game, Carlsen decided to keep a bit more tension. White played knight a4. There's a lot of ways you could play it. You could play a3 and also go for this pawn storm as well. That would also be a very legitimate way to play it. Because when you get in b4, you are also kind of supporting knight c5 in a way, which is, of course, a very standard plan. These sort of symmetrical structures saying that it's easier for you to get the knight to c5 than it is for them to get the knight to c4. That being said, probably knight b6 is still a good move here for black to keep the disadvantage to a minimum in some way. But as it happened, yeah, the game saw knight to a4, bishop e7, h3. I mean, objectively speaking, I don't think white has that much of an edge here. But again, it's just very, very safe, and it's kind of hard for black to kind of do a whole lot at this point. Move like h6, you can play it, but then it's like, well, what's your follow-up if white plays b4, for example? And here I think that the way that black probably should play it in hindsight would be a move like b5 here. Not just because the engine says a top line, but also does kind of give you that sort of asymmetrical structure, so just gives you a bit more scope to kind of play. That being said, in the position after knight d4, I do think white is slightly better here, where you do have this pass pawn that will soon be a protected pass pawn. You're kind of happy to see a move like e5 because it actually just leaves black with a very weak pawn on d5 that we can just basically pound away at from this point. But if black does play bishop d4, yeah, even this sort of position is it's still going to be kind of nice for white, just having the bishop pair to work with an otherwise fairly quiet sort of position. And white's moves are pretty natural from this point, so it's even here white would still have a small edge probably, but at least it's a position where you can have a bit of an imbalance as black and still maybe have some small hope to win the game if white were to lose control at some point. But instead, Carlsen plays knight to a5. And here white finds a very nice response, not b4 allowing knight c4, but instead playing the move. I mean, yeah, you could start with b4 as well. It wouldn't make that big a difference. But knight c5 was the move order that Wesley So played in the game, realizing that you can't take twice on c5 because if you do, there's going to be the b4 fork, of course, to win a piece. To avoid this issue, Carlsen started with the move knight c4, but now the move b4 is a good reply. And if you're wondering what happens if black does play the move knight a3, well, then we will play knight b7, and we'll kind of see here that, with this attack on the knight and the pawn, that, clearly white has come out on top from this trade. This sort of thing would be just a complete strategic disaster from black's point of view. So instead, black goes knight c5. But here after dc5, Carlsen gets a little bit too greedy here, where probably the best move is actually to play bishop f6, which might seem kind of weird, but the idea is that if you take that, you're not actually threatening to play rook c4 here, because there is bishop d3 to win the exchange, and thanks to this tactic, this is basically what allows black to have maybe not a completely equal position, but at least a playable position after bishop f6, and maybe some ideas of forking the rook and the pawn at the right moment. But instead of that, Carlsen plays knight a3. And let me ask you this. Let's say if you have this position and you're playing against Magnus Carlsen, what would be your move here as white? And if you need more time to think about it, you're welcome to do so. Also, one thing I will mention as well before I reveal the answer is that if you're thinking of playing a move like Queen b3 or Queen a4, those moves are certainly very natural, and it's true that you are, in the case of say Knight c4, you're going to get the pawn back, or if they play Knight b5, you can also get this sort of position where even though they're up a pawn, their structure leaves a lot to be desired. Let's say, but even a position like this, you could say that black is reasonably solid. It's kind of hard to make all that much, I think, of white's position here. So I kind of prefer Wesley So's move at knight d4, which is playing a little bit more to dominate that knight on a3 instead. Bishop e4 is a good response, just provoking that little bit of a weakening f3 before going back to g6. By the way, this is known as the Shanklin principle, where rather than playing a move immediately, you play a kind of intermediate move to provoke a weakening move from the opponent. So f3 being the weakening move in this case. Even so, after queen b3, knight c4, still the position remains slightly better for white, as so also indicated after the game. In fact, if black wants to have even a playable position, you probably have to play a move like bishop g5 and just kind of trade off this very strong bishop to at least kind of bring the game to, where white's edge is only rather small. You could take on g5, or you could let them take, but it's not going to massively change the nature of the position either way, in fairness. Still white will have a little bit of a small grip over the position on the dark squares, while the bishop here perhaps is a little bit of a ghost. But instead, black plays queen e8, and again, I think that Carlsen's refusal to kind of try and simplify kind of was his downfall here, where after bishop g3 and e5, so e5 is a little bit of a tricky move, like trying to exchange off some of the pieces in this kind of way, where a position like this actually being quite fine for black. But the move of knight b3 is just a lot more effective. It keeps this in reserve, but also opens up some ideas to attack the weakness. Carlsen tries to avoid this with bishop d8, but in hindsight, it probably would be better to play some other move, like maybe even h6, just still keeping this trick kind of in reserve. At the same time, if h6 is the best move, it sort of makes it clear that white has a fairly good control over a position like this. So after bishop d8, this one's another good puzzle. What would be the move that So played here? And if you find this move, you're definitely well on the way to winning the game. So let's see if you can find it. And also you can put in the comments below. Like this is a good one to put in the comments here to see how many of you got it. I didn't realize there, of course, you could like fast forward, and then say, oh yeah, I saw it all along after seeing my answer. But yeah, I think we can trust you guys, to be honest. Yeah. So for this position, and again, last chance if you need more time to pause, but the answer is that queen d5 is basically just winning the pawn here with the double attack. I'm not so clear what Carlsen actually missed at this point, but in the game after queen b5. Okay, so what he missed was I think Carlsen thought that he could play queen b4 and keep material parity. The problem is that after bishop d6, rook e8, and now the move c6, we're hitting the queen and the pawn. It's obviously you're hitting the pawn, but you're also going to have just this, pawn that's about to queen as well. So it's just completely unplayable for black, meaning that black had to sell for bishop e7, but at this point, I mean, computer points out you even have just an outright win with knight a5 apparently, but okay, so play queen e2 instead. Still keeps a very big advantage, of course, by his upper pawn, and just has very good control over the position. The bishops aren't really doing a heck of a lot for black at this point. And the rest of the game I'll just play through fairly quickly. There were not many more moves here. G4 again, just keeping the bishop contained. F6, F4. F4 maybe is a little bit weakening potentially, but there isn't really a way to kind of exploit it. And you do have ways to kind of get at the black king later on with a little preparation. But still, this probably gives better chance for black to hold than the game where after queen c6, white was just really able to stamp his control over the position. Yeah, I mean, technically could even play g5 immediately, even as a sack, just to kind of get at the black king, but rook c2 first, of course, is not really spoiling anything either. Bishop h5, and yeah, Robert Hess's annotations are slightly critical of this g6 move, but I think it's perfectly fine, where you're just basically shutting out the king and the bishop. And yeah, so rather than allowing the counterplay with along this file, decides to play a little bit of a move of b5, which, yeah, it's sort of a little bit of a practical one where you give back the pawn, but just sort of slow down the potential counterplay against our king. Now, black probably has to play queen d7, and it's still very bad for black, but this gives black a slightly better chance to survive, like 5% instead of 0% in the game. Because after queen c6, rook b6, queen c8, yeah, we see that this isn't really a good way to defend the pawn. If you play a move like rook a7, even just queen f7, and it's just very hard to get out of this c6 using the pin that way. So black tries a4, but after takes and c6, black resigned as it just isn't really a good defense to the inevitable invasion with the pawn. And a kind of a principle of two weaknesses. Black saw position his pieces to defend the king, but now he can't defend against the passer on the c file. So that would be, yeah, that was all in this game. So a very clean win by Wesley So. I do think this is one of the best games of So's career. To beat the world champion really without all that much of a fight. And with that, we now get to the final game for this video, which is going to be a game that was played in the World Rapid Championship of 2024, where at the end of day one, yeah, Carlsen, even though he was the top seed, only started with a score of 2.5 out of 5. So you could say maybe his worst performance over a single day, maybe in the last, I don't know, 15 years probably, maybe even more than that. But still, this game that Denis Lazovic played with the white pieces, yeah, sort of sees a very similar opening. It's a little bit different because in the So game we had knight a for f6, a3 and rook c1, but you kind of see a similar option that after a6, Lazovic again plays the move rook c1, making the point that okay, you don't really have better than the move bishop f5 anyway, because at bishop g4, well, white has some different options like either f3 if you want to make the position a bit more dynamic, or you can go bishop b2, and even though you're trading pieces, you are kind of developing with a tempo. So you do get a little bit of a lead in development to work with here as white. But bishop f5 was played, and yeah, rather than the rook c8, that's played again. So this time Carlsen plays e6, and like I mentioned before, when e6 is played, queen b3 does gain a bit in strength. As now with black plays knight a5, which was a very good move with the rook on c8 instead. Well, now queen a4 is just super strong as b5, as I mentioned before, runs in a bishop b5 or knight b5. Actually, both moves are kind of winning. Let's just go with knight b5 because it's a little bit simpler to understand. Like a position like this is, yeah, just going to be completely crushing. Like bishop c7, queen c8, knight e5, and you just don't really have a good way out of the pin here as black. So that's why in the game Carlsen played rook a7. Though I do think that maybe a move such as bishop b4 probably is a better try. In this case, maybe Lazovic would have gone knight h4 and just nursed, very patiently this bishop pair advantage with very little risk. But in the game, rook a7 was played, and it's true the rook is a little bit misplaced. And I mean, it's all by showing the other two games. I think it's very easy, to cherry pick and say, oh, Carlsen lost one game and he has, and therefore it's a weakness. But it's also true that with the form that Carlsen had in day one, probably could have played any opening and it would have not still not been a great outcome if you're just having the worst day of your entire life in a sense. But even so, like when you sort of see the previous two games, you do notice that little bit of a pattern, right? And If white had played the move of h3, just kind of doing a little bit of a prophylaxis against g5, I think that this sort of position would just be very nice for white. Rafael Leitao, in his notes, makes a very good point. This whole pawn storm is just not that effective here, but only if you find this move of bishop h3, d3 to sort of trade off the bishops and kind of just neutralize the pressure on h3 in this fashion. So that's kind of the move that white had to see, like I guess bishop d3, maybe a move that both players might have missed in the game. But that being said, the move of knight a4 is honestly not so bad either. Like it's maybe practically not as good as h3, but it's not an outright mistake. So Carlsen does play g5, which does actually prove to be quite good here. And the move bishop g3 would be quite normal, but then after h5, we're seeing that black is getting some good counterplay in this case. And for example, a move like h3, does give a hook where black is getting an attack here with the rook on the h file, and a position like this would just be quite fine for black with the extra space and the knight being a little bit stuck. And also, if white does play knight to c5, you just kind of take it and you're okay. So Lazovic decides to play a little bit creatively with the move of bishop to e5, kind of asking black a question of how he's going to deal with this, because if you play a move like f6, now this pawn storm's a lot less effective. And again, we see an example of the Shanklin principle being a sub-theme, because now you can play the move h4 without losing a pawn to g takes h4. If you compare it to this position like h4, gh4 would, of course, be quite decent for black, but here it just doesn't really make sense for black to take anymore, so white would just be much better. So the answer is not the move f6. The way that Carlsen should have played it is actually to take on e5, so something like knight c takes c5, takes, and this is the way that Carlsen should play it, just simplifying the position and then just castling. Might look like our king has been unsafe, but f4 just doesn't really do a whole lot when we've got a lot of pressure on the queen side, and with black having the bishop here, he should be doing quite well in a position like this. It has actually happened in game Graf against Grishuk in European Championship 2003, but instead Carlsen played the move of castle short. And white's next move here might surprise you a little bit, so let's see who can perhaps find this move. What would be your move as white in this situation? So, in the end, you can pause the video if you need more time to think about it. But basically, black's threat is he wants to go g4, kick the knight out of the way, and then take a pawn with knight takes e5. So a move like h3 avoids it, but again, it just kind of leads to a similar position to what we just saw, where black is, just going to be totally fine in a position like this. Just play down the c file, and there's not a whole lot white can really do to get an attack brewing on the king, which is actually reasonably safe here. So here, last we came up with a bit of a more advanced version of the Shanklin principle, because the Shanklin principle normally applies just with pawn moves, but sometimes it'll even apply with non-pawn moves where maybe the opponent's piece moved to a worse square, and then we play, the move that we could have played immediately on move two instead after a little intermediate move first. So it's a very subtle point, but actually bishop g3 is clearly the best move here. And the point is that you actually would rather have the king on e8 than on g8 in this position. And the game kind of demonstrates why, because rather than just playing bishop g6 and just accepting that, okay, you're slightly worse, but the position is reasonably solid still, Carlsen continues to try to attack with h5 and g4. But already you might notice the difference that the rook is now on f8 instead of h8, which is not really as good, because after knight h2, well, we don't have the move rook g8 anymore, which actually makes a big difference, because after knight f6, the key move for white here, and well done if you saw this in advance, is the move of queen to d1. And because you don't have rook g8 to defend the pawn, white basically just wins a pawn for absolutely nothing. So this is kind of a nice trick, and it's very obvious that Carlsen didn't see this queen d1 retreat when playing this way in the game. But yeah, after 94, white, I mean, you can just take the pawn and not really care about the double pawns because you do have the open lines to the king, but the move bishop f4 is a very practical one, which does allow you to kind of it allows you to grab the pawn without a significant weakening of your structure. This pawn can be defended with knight f3 later as needed. Yeah, I mean, at this point, maybe bishop g6 might have been the best defensive try, but given that white is already up a pawn, I'll go through the rest of the game fairly quickly and just kind of let you enjoy Lasvik's technique, because even though his rating here is only 2553 rapid, we all know that the FIDE rapid and blitz ratings are not the most accurate, to put it mildly. And given that Lasvik, did make like the losers sort of, semi-final section in the recent like Champions Chess League, like it's pretty obvious the guy's like 700 plus strength in rapid in reality. So yeah, knight c3, just keeping the pressure here, make sure all the pieces are on good squares. Sort of very simple technical play is really the area where last we can hold his own even against many of the best players in the world. But yeah, at this point, he just doesn't really give Black a chance to escape. Just knight h4 just shuts down all that counterplay down the h file. Black still has a litany of weaknesses in the position. So rook h1, king f8, and okay, it's true that actually the players missed a little tactic that knight g6 does win in exchange, but okay, Lasvik saw it the second time here with the move knight g6. And Carlsen tried giving up the queen, hoping to, create some sort of fortress, but it's, yeah, never really going to happen here. And, just a matter of just targeting the weaknesses. If they do play b5, yeah, queen a3, and they can't defend a6, so Black losing the pawn regardless. But after knight c6, queen a6, rook g4, yeah, it's just a mopping up process. And at this point, after a few more meaningless moves, yeah, Black is just resigned here. There's no answer to the advance of the a pawn. So yeah, very convincing win by last week against Carlsen. Just never really giving Black a chance to get back into the game after this, ill-timed h5 g4. And with that now, you know what Magnus Carlsen's biggest weakness is. That it's basically these very symmetrical kind of structures that either arise in the exchange Slav, with the exchange Slav in particular being sort of this area where there's sort of decent scope to kind of outplay with the white pieces. Now, of course, it is true that, Carlsen doesn't always play the Slav. As, the greatest player of all time, he is very capable of playing virtually all types of positions, in fact. He does play, things like the Nimzo, the, Kingsley and Grunfeld, also, E6, DC4. So, of course, you won't always be able to get a symmetrical position, but if you are able to, you can basically leverage the fact that as a lower rated player, he will take some risks to try to win the game. And those risks may then give you some chances to outplay him, or perhaps more precisely, for him to outplay himself. But yeah, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.